Is this on? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Kapano and Naziswa for inviting me, and Kapano for getting me to the point where I can hopefully deliver this presentation. And thanks very much to both Jose and Floretta, who I think have laid the groundwork for what I'm going to speak to today. So today I'm going to be sharing some preliminary thoughts for my PhD, which, as Kapano has mentioned, is entitled Post-Rape Subjectivities. And this study, which draws on both my own as well as others' experience of being raped, aims to examine the ways in which those who have survived sexual violence are able to make sense of their experiences in a context where dominant discourses construct sexual violence and sexual violation in particular as deeply problematic, or rather in deeply problematic ways. And I think I'll just talk to the nature of my insertion into the research project, as Jose has suggested we do. As Kapano has mentioned, I worked as a counselor at Rape Crisis, probably about 3 or 4 years. And I saw predominantly, although not exclusively, black working class women while I was there. And so I heard a lot about, not only about their rapes, but about how their rapes were read by people around them, by the government services that they accessed. And then, in a rather ironic twist of fate, I myself was raped nearly in 2015. And I realized through various levels of the experience, some of which I'll talk to today, that my experience was deeply different from a lot of the women that I'd seen and talked to. And that I didn't have the responses to those, by those around me, to the services that I accessed were completely different. And so that has made me interested in the way in which post-rape subjectivities are shaped by intersections of race, class, and sexuality, among other social categories of identity. And I'm using the term here, subjectivity, in the way that Chris Whedon has articulated it, as the conscious and unconscious thoughts and emotions of the individual, her sense of herself, and her ways of understanding her relation to the world. And so in this presentation, I will be reflecting on how post-rape subjectivities are raced. And by this, I mean the ways in which discourses of race constitute what it means to be raped in uneven and unequal ways. And I will reflect specifically on the ways in which these subjectivities cannot be untangled from dominant colonial discourses of blackness and whiteness. And I must just say, I will be clutching quite tightly to my notes and relying quite heavily on the words that I've tried to carefully, sensitively, and critically craft on what for me is a rather precarious topic, and I hope you will forgive me for this. So I start by sharing a personal experience, which for me was a key moment in which the racial constitution of my own post-rape subjectivity became uncomfortably meaningful. And so about a month after I was raped, I was in the waiting room of the Hedefeld Thuthuzela Care Center. And for those of you who don't know, a Thuthuzela Care Center, or a TCC, is a one-stop government facility which provides an integrated approach to rape care, including medical treatment, counseling, and access to the police. And so I'm sitting in the waiting room, and there is another woman sitting on the opposite couch from me. She looks about 18, and she's black. And in her hand, she's holding the care package and the information booklet that I received when I came in a month ago, a few hours after I was raped. And so the nurse approaches the two of us in the waiting room, and she turns to me and she says, "Who are you bringing for an appointment?" And I look at her confused. And she says, "Who is the patient?" So I say, "I'm the patient." "Oh," she says. She looks surprised. But she doesn't ask the other woman who the patient is. And in a context in which the bodies of black women are repeatedly constructed as the sites of sexual violence, and I think this links to what Floretta has spoken about, it's unnecessary for her to clarify what the other woman is doing there. And after the nurse leaves, I don't do or say anything. I sit quietly staring at my feet, waiting for my name to be called. And reflecting on this moment is deeply uncomfortable for me, not least because of my complicity in rendering the exceptional trauma of the woman sitting across from me as unremarkable, and reinforcing that she, in some way, belongs there, whereas I don't. But this discomfort has been instructive for me for thinking about why my presence, the presence of a white woman at a government clinic, is unbelievable, or at least questioned, while the presence of a black woman is not. And so my discomfort has been productive in thinking about the mechanisms by which post-rape subjectivities are raced, as well as the implications of this. So in reflecting on the impact of rape and gesturing towards Kapano's already mentioned Aimé Césaire's concept of thingification, Abrahams has argued that, physical pain aside, the enduring trauma as rape is that, like slavery, it makes a person a thing. It denies human subjectivity. A woman who has been raped is implicated. It has happened, and she has to give it a meaning, any meaning that enables her to make sense of its horror, even the possibility that she herself was somehow to blame. Thus, the dehumanization of rape does not lie in the act alone, nor in the memory of it, but in the trauma which induces the rape victim to deny her own subjectivity. And as I will try and show, this process of thingification, or as Abrahams calls it here, the denial of one's own subjectivity, is intimately intertwined with discourses of rape, discourses which make certain bodies more easily into things. And so for me, the incident in the waiting room reveals the way in which some bodies are regarded as destined or inevitable to become things. That is, the ways in which black women, in particular, become to be regarded as always already raped. And therefore, their actual rapes are neither surprising nor particularly horrifying. And Pumla Kala has argued that black women are in fact unrapeable. And by this, she does not mean that black women are not raped, but rather that they are safe to rape, or that raping them is not regarded as harm. And this unrapeability is constituted through colonial constructions of race, which thingified both black men and black women. So within colonial South Africa, rape was regarded as an outrage because it transgressed the limits of respectable sexuality, and perhaps also because it destabilized the boundary between the private and the public, as Chose has spoken about. However, this outrage was only seen as worthy of public concern if the raped woman could plausibly claim respectability in the first place. And so black women, who through systems of colonialism and slavery were regarded as not having honor to lose, could not be raped within the system. And I would argue that the denial and dismissal of harm that happens to black people, and particularly black women, rooted in colonial constructions of race, continues to shape contemporary representations and responses to sexual violence. So one recent example is the case of Sinqolo Masavuka, whose rape and murder only garnered media attention once a journalist made a comparison between her case and that of Francisca Blochlinger, who was raped and murdered in Tokai Forest. And I think this speaks to the disparity of representation and what Floretta was talking about the way in which certain women or certain violations are represented. And particularly striking was that picture that Floretta put up of the ID book, because I think commonly the photographs of black women those are the only photographs of black women that were ever shown. Whereas when other women are harmed, we get a much fuller picture of their kind of humanity and what has been lost in the loss of their life or in the violation that is rape. And here, I think very tellingly, Sinqolo's cousin remarks, in relation to this disparity in the way in which these cases were represented and responded to, it makes us realize that no one cares about us because we are black. And so within this dominant framework, like Sinqolo, the woman sitting across from me in the waiting room represents just another black woman. She becomes indistinguishable from the endless stream of black women whose broken bodies are casually splashed across the pages of the media. And in their unspectacularity, these rapes become normal and these traumas become mundane. Within the context of the United States, Judith Butler has written about the ways in which some lives, and here she refers specifically to the lives of Arab people who have been killed by US forces, are ungrievable. She argues that in the US, this ungrievability is shaped by the silencing and erasure of these deaths. As Butler says, and I quote, "There are no obituaries for the war casualties that the United States inflicts. The obituary functions as the instrument by which the grievability is publicly distributed. It is the means by which a life becomes, or fails to become, a publicly grievable life." While it is definitely the case that many instances of sexual violence perpetrated against both black and white women, and particularly those who do not involve extreme physical violence and those perpetrated by partners, family members, and acquaintances rather than strangers, are silenced, and therefore these instances are not grievable, I would argue that the repeated representation of black women's bodies as the sites of sexual violence, which construct this type of violence as inevitable and unremarkable, also makes these acts of violation ungrievable. And so in this context, I believe it's pertinent we ask ourselves the following questions, which are outlined by Butler. To what extent have black women fallen outside the human, as it has been naturalized in its Western colonial mold? What are the cultural contours of the human at work here? How do the cultural frames for thinking the human set limits on what kinds of violences we can avow as violence? And finally, the question that I'm interested in, what are the implications of this for post-rape subjectivity? And I believe that asking these questions makes explicit the precarious position that the woman across from me in the waiting room occupies. She is constructed within the contemporary neoliberal capitalist democratic context as a free woman, entitled to her rights over her body and entitled, if these rights are violated, to complain. But when she comes to the clinic, or tells those around her, or goes to the police, we see how this access to equality, justice, and even the recognition of the violation itself are contingent upon being a particular kind of subject. She is thus doubly violated by the rape and simultaneously by her construction as unrapeable, unharmable, and inevitably thingified. And so I've spent far more time, I now see, in reflecting on the ways in which the woman in the waiting room's post-rape subjectivity is constituted by her blackness, and far less time reflecting on how my post-rape subjectivity is constituted by my whiteness. And this, I fear, is partly as a result of white privilege operating at its best. But I have been coerced, partly by the invitation to give this presentation, to engage in more critical and uncomfortable self-reflection. And so, in contrast to the other woman, my presence in the waiting room is spectacular. Unlike the rapes of black women, the rapes of white women, and in particular acts committed by strange, usually black men, are represented as horrifying anomalies. These are what we call real rapes. And so the positioning of the rapes of white women as outrageous is intertwined with the construction of whiteness as not only racially, but also morally and sexually distinct from blackness, as Capano has argued. This construction of sexuality was central to the formation of colonial empire within the South African context, and in particular in demarcating who was colonizer and who was colonized, and thereby in establishing the public and personal bounds of race. In this context, as Scheffer and Ratele have argued, and I quote, the potential and actual sexual position of white women by black men represented an invasion of the entire white nation, since it represents black male control over white male possession and possible destabilization of white male power. And I think this talks to women's responsibility to the nation state, as Chaucer spoke about earlier, and the ways in which white women were sort of holders of the colonial empire in their ability to breed more white colonizers. And so, by virtue of my whiteness, as it intersects with my middle classness and the fact that I was raped by a black man, my rape becomes recognizable as a real rape, and therefore it becomes grievable in a way that the rape of the woman sitting across from me in the waiting room is not. But the grievability of my rape simultaneously facilitates a crisis, one that calls into question and destabilizes my whiteness, a crisis that is rooted in the colonial construction of whiteness as respectability. And the relationship between whiteness and respectability, or in this case, unrespectability, is highlighted by the words of this magistrate in the 19th century Cape Colony. But I believe they still hold weight in our contemporary context. He remarks, there is a large proportion of virtuous women in this colony, principally of pure or nearly pure European blood, many of whom would prefer death to being dishonored, on all of whom the commission of rape on their person would inflict the most poignant and permanent mental anguish and grief, and whom, especially if committed by a colored man, it would so degrade in the estimation of their associates as to drive them from the society and mar all their prospects of happiness in life. Therefore, in occupying the position as the grievable raped woman, I must also occupy the position as the fallen white woman. Therefore, my post-rape subjectivity is constituted both by the sexual violation of my body and the ideological violation of my white respectability. And as I mentioned, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the other woman in the waiting room and thinking that her post-rape subjectivity was far more precarious than mine. And in doing this, inevitably, I reinforce her precariousness. But in thinking a little further, it's become clear to me that thinking of who is more precarious is perhaps not helpful. And rather, it is a matter of interrogating how we are both constituted by the ways in which our rapes come to have meaning only in relation to our specific positionings in a context which remains saturated with racist systems of power. And so it's difficult to know how to bring this to a close when I feel that I've only just begun untangling and retangling the innumerable strings that tie together race, rape, and subjectivity. What I have tried to show is the ways in which the post-rape subjectivities of both black and white women are constituted in problematic ways by the enduring power of colonial constructions of race and personhood. Although I originally saw my post-rape subjectivity as disconnected from the woman across from me in the waiting room, it has become clear that the grievability of my rape is only possible in relation to the ungrievability of hers. This is the enduring mark of colonialism on our bodies, but also our psyches. And so, in thinking towards decolonization then, I would like to end with the words of Judith Butler. She says, "For if I am confounded by you, then you are already of me, and I am nowhere without you. I cannot master the we, except by finding the way in which I am tied to you, by trying to translate, but finding that my own language must break up and yield if I am to know you. You are what I gain through this disorientation and loss. This is how the human comes into being, again and again, as that which we have yet to know." Thank you.